Hello friends, my name is JJ, and a bit of an unusual video for you this week, and not one I originally planned on making. You know, I do not want this to be a channel where we just talk about whatever random thing is in the Canadian news this week, but this week in particular there has been some news that I really do think is worth discussing. So, you've all heard me talk ad nauseum about Bill C-11, but while I've been fixating on that, there has been another bill called Bill C-18, which is proving just as consequential, if not arguably perhaps more. Bill C-18 is basically the Trudeau government's project to save the Canadian news media. But without putting too fine of a point on it, the bill is so ill-conceived and proving to be so counterproductive in practice that it is actually throwing the future of the free press in Canada into doubt. So let me just give you a little bit of background here. Basically, it is very difficult to make money in the Canadian news industry. You can take my word for it because I've had several jobs working in Canadian journalism, and every single time I have been laid off for explicitly financial reasons. You know, Canada has plenty of newspapers and news magazines and news TV channels, but they are generally all chronically losing money. I think there's quite a lot of reasons why they are finding it hard to turn a profit. You know, Canada is a relatively small media market. I think a lot of Canadians are just not that interested in Canadian news. I would argue that the quality of a lot of Canadian journalism is quite low when compared to the quality of journalism you can get in the States. There are also lots of barriers to foreign ownership of news media in Canada, which has probably prevented a lot of international capital from keeping some of these failed enterprises afloat. You know, I'm sure that there are a lot of internal financial decisions in the way that some of Canada's big newspapers and things have been run that are probably also causing some of the hardship as well. But for whatever the reason, the simple fact is, yes, it is very difficult to make money if you're in the business of Canadian news in the year 2023. I feel like the only thing we've really sort of seen approximating a strategy on the industry side has been greater and greater mergers. You know, I once talked to a newspaper guy who compared this to kind of, you know, a vampire finding more and more victims to suck blood from. There's a big story in the Canadian media right now about sort of the two largest surviving Canadian newspaper conglomerates are now proposing to merge. Both of these enterprises are suffering financially, so this makes a lot of sense. But anyway, in the context of this dire climate, the Trudeau administration comes along and says, never fear, we can save the day. Maybe government is the helping hand that a failing news industry needs. But you know, this raises all sorts of philosophical concerns of its own. The news media reports on the government, so we don't necessarily want these two parties in bed together. And so what happens is that the government and the Canadian news media get together and start aggressively pushing a narrative in which the failure of the Canadian news media is blamed on a very unsympathetic villain, which is the big American tech companies. Okay, so now what I'm going to say is not going to make any sense to you, so just be prepared. But what happens is that the Canadian media companies and the Canadian government begin pushing this line that the reason why the Canadian news media is failing is because the big American tech companies, specifically the social media companies, are actively stealing Canadian news. You know, when you go onto social media, Twitter or Facebook or whatever, and you start scrolling down your feed, you'll often see links to news stories that your friends or family are sharing. And this supposedly is the great theft that we're seeing. These sinister tech companies are allowing people to take content from Canadian news websites and distribute it on their platforms. And then the media companies say that this fact is causing them, you know, I don't know, millions and millions of dollars in lost revenue, and this is the reason why they can't make any money. Again, this really does not make any sense at all, because obviously the purpose of sharing a link is to get users of that social media to go and visit the website that that link is from, and the media companies obviously know this, which is why they themselves have active social media accounts that do nothing but post links to their own content on Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of it all day long. But anyway, despite the lack of logic, this is the argument that is now enshrined in Canadian law via Bill C-18. The main thing that Bill C-18 does is it mandates the big tech companies negotiate some sort of fair compensation with the Canadian media companies, you know, based on the premise that the Canadian media companies are deserving some sort of compensation. It is sort of conceptually similar to, you know, an employer negotiating with a union to come up with fair compensation for the workers. And again, similar to sort of how labor relations work work, Bill C-18 gives the Canadian government the power to impose some sort of deal if the two parties cannot negotiate one themselves. The legislation literally uses a lot of labor-style terminology, you know, bargaining, arbitration, and so on. Now, the tech companies, as you might imagine, do not accept the core premises of this bill, which is, again, the idea that they owe the Canadian media companies some sort of fair compensation for the fact that links to media company content is freely provided on their platforms. You know, the Minister of Canadian Heritage, who has sort of been the point man on this particular legislative file, he loves to use the line that the tech companies have to pay their fair share. Very sort of delightfully Randian turn of phrase. But it is very Randian in the sense that one of the main arguments that the Canadian media companies have made is just that the big sort of social media platforms are hogging all of the ad revenue that the internet has to offer. I've heard the numbers thrown around that like 80 to 90% of all advertising on the internet these days is just done on a couple of the big sort of tech platform websites. And then so the Canadian media companies are just like, hey, we deserve a share of that. And then the Canadian government is like, yes, pay your fair share. But yes, anyway, so the tech companies lobbied very, very hard against this legislation when it was sort of going through the parliamentary pipeline. But it passed anyway and was signed into law just a couple of days ago. And so the tech companies are now really playing hardball. In response to the legislation becoming law, the other day Meta, which is the company that of course controls Facebook and Instagram, announced that they are no longer going to allow the sharing of links to Canadian news publications on their platforms. And then, in addition to that, Google also announced that they are also not going to allow the sharing of links to Canadian news websites on their search engine. So the companies are basically calling the government's bluff on this. If you are going to say that sharing links is a form of theft, well then fine, we'll just make it so no one can share. You know, the government was obviously operating on the basis that when push came to shove, the tech companies would play ball with this arbitration system that they created. But you know, I guess that Canada is a small enough market and the sharing of links to Canadian news websites is a small enough proportion of what Canadians do online that the tech companies are willing to sort of sacrifice it. I guess they've crunched the numbers and calculated that making the user experience slightly worse for their Canadian users is worth it if it means that they can avoid, you know, what they imagine to be this kind of extortive racket that the Canadian government is trying to impose on them for basically doing, in their mind, nothing wrong. But the way in which that user experience will be worse for Canadian users is very consequential in a sort of broader cultural democratic sense. You know, the quality of Canadian news that is provided by these big Canadian news companies, you know, it's not perfect, but it's still the dominant way that most of us learn about what's going on in this country. Being passively fed links to news articles through our social media feeds is probably not ideal either, but it's still not a terrible system. The passive way that a lot of us use social media probably does in fact expose us to a lot of stories that we might not otherwise read. You see things that your friends or family members are sharing and you know they're intriguing and you click on the links and yeah, you might read something that you might not have read on your own volition. Living in a country where you cannot share links to news articles on social media, I think would then have the effect of just making the country broadly much more ignorant. Because then what would happen is that you would only basically follow the news if you went to the news website directly, you know, through your favorites tab or whatever. And I just think that very few people are going to be bothered to do that kind of thing, you know, unless they're the real sort of hardcore news junkies for whom consuming news is kind of just a hobby or a passionate interest unto itself. And then you sort of think about, well, what are the consequences for a public that is just more ignorant, and you know that has consequences for how people vote and all sorts of things like that. So yeah, it's not a great development. Again, to sort of continue the labor metaphor, this might all wind up being a lot of sort of theater. The Trudeau government certainly seems to be operating on the assumption that this is just a lot of bluster from the tech companies and that they will ultimately crack and break down and participate in the arbitration system that Bill C-18 outlines. But you know, to me the bigger story here is just like the kind of country that I think Canada is becoming under this current government. You know, the Trudeau administration is a government that loves to regulate and really seems to have a lot of interest in regulating media in particular. And I think that this is something that you want to sort of tinker with very delicately in a democratic society. This government instead kind of tends to go in guns a-blazing, and they don't really seem to have kind of thought through the consequences of their actions, what they will mean for, you know, for the state of Canada's sort of democratic health. And that to me is very troubling. Obviously, that's been the main reason why I've been so worried about Bill C-11, but this bill, already is sort of causing consequences that, could certainly be as significant as anything Bill C-11 does, or as I said, possibly even worse. There's also the question of just kind of like, is Canada a country that you want to do business in anymore? Like, there's always this dream that Canada is going to be some sort of great tech hub or great innovation hub. Right now the Canadian government has this whole initiative where we're going to like poach the best and brightest from America, and they're going to move to Canada and do their magic here. But it's like, why would you want to do that? Like, when the government is so hostile to success and innovation and all the rest of it, it's like, what exactly is Canada's great pitch? I guess it's that our government will have your back if your business is failing, even if that means sacrificing a lot of democratic virtues along the way. But it's like I said, I've worked in Canadian journalism for many years. I'm very sensitive to the difficulties that this industry is facing right now. But that's true in a lot of places, and I don't think anywhere else is really resorting to schemes quite as extortive as what the Canadian government is attempting to do to solve the problem. And again, like Bill C-11, I think it's important that Canada, as a supposed good player in sort of the democratic world, that we set a good example for other countries, and we do not model irresponsible behavior the way that I believe we are doing right now with C-18. But in any case, I'm curious to hear what you all have to say, if you have any sympathy at all for what the government is trying to do here, or if perhaps you have another strategy of how we can help a failing news industry, not just in Canada, but around the world. It does not seem like there are particularly obvious solutions on the table, so some sort of creative thinking is probably necessary. But assuming that some sort of sustainable solution is eventually found, I very much doubt it will look like Bill C-18.